Okay, well, I've got a picture in my slideshow here. If you could bring that up. There we go. Does anybody know who this is? Okay, we've got a couple of hands. We got a hand here. Anybody else recognize this person? I'm not going to make you like shout out a name or anything, so if you're kind of on the line, you can even raise your hand. This is Yuri Gagarin. Yuri Gagarin was the first person to ever go into space. On April 12, 1961, he was strapped into a capsule, put on top of a rocket, shot up into space, did one full orbit around the Earth, and then came back. Yuri Gagarin was a national hero in Russia. He was a Russian cosmonaut, and man, was an extremely courageous person. Just this event, but other stories that he was engaged in, he was kind of the epitome of bravery, and will never be forgotten. He holds a place in history that is solidified. Everyone knows, this name is one that will be remembered forever. But I'm kind of a history nerd, and I also kind of like maybe like unsolved mysteries and weird conspiracies and that kind of stuff. And a couple years ago, I had this story float across my radar, and the pitch was that Yuri Gagarin wasn't the first guy in space. There's these two brothers in Italy, and they were big ham radio operators, and so they just like to listen to signals going on. And supposedly, this happened in April, supposedly November of the year before, they had been listening in and picked up on a radio conversation between a Russian cosmonaut and ground control. But this was kind of an ill-fated expedition, and what they listened to, what they heard, was basically the story of this person being lost. And things went wrong, they overshot the target, and eventually radio contact was dropped. And supposedly this person was absolutely lost in space. And Russia, being in the middle of this space race with the Americans and really not having the absolute best record of human rights anyway, supposedly just kind of scrubbed the whole thing, acted like it didn't happen, and then moved on. I don't know about you, but this story, it's kind of haunted me. It's kind of disturbing. It really catches my attention. I can't quite walk away from it. And I think the reason that it catches me so much is the absolute raw isolation that person would have experienced in those circumstances. You couldn't possibly be more removed from other people than kind of that scenario. I can't imagine the loneliness there. And as we talk about this idea of boundaries tonight, the reason I bring it up is because on one side, we have no boundaries at all. And on the other side, we have a situation where we build barriers and walls. And on both spectrums, on both ends, we end up in a place where we're very, very isolated. We end up distanced from people. And we end up with these relationships that are unhealthy and unworkable. And we don't really function in a good way. Now I'm going to let you off the hook just a tiny little bit, because most historians believe that this did not happen. The idea that a couple of amateur ham radio operators could have picked up on this signal and that the American government didn't is maybe a little much. They actually recorded this, and there's some real problems with the recording. So hopefully it didn't actually happen, but the idea still kind of hangs with me. So we're going to be talking about boundaries tonight, and I want to acknowledge kind of a big source for me in this conversation. It's the book Boundaries by Dr. Cloud and Dr. Townsend. And if you are interested in this topic at all, I really encourage you to spend some time with this specific book. He also has written several others: Boundaries in Marriage, Boundaries in Parenting, Boundaries at Work. There's a whole series of them, and they could be useful depending upon kind of what category you might want to really look at a little bit deeper. But I'm going to be using several ideas from his material tonight, so I just want to acknowledge that. And I'm also going to use his definition of boundaries. Basically what he says boundaries are, and a good way to think of them, is like a property line. So I've got my space of property, and the thing that's really useful about that is I know where it ends and where it begins. And the good part of that is when I have my boundaries in place, I've got a lot of freedom within that space. I can do what I want there for the most part. but I also know what stuff I'm responsible for and what I'm not. So a great big sinkhole opens up on my property, yeah, that's my problem. I got to figure out something for that. I got to figure out what's going on there. If it happens on my neighbor's property, I'm going to probably keep an eye on that, but it's not mine to deal with. And so that's really how we're going to approach boundaries today, is where does my stuff start and where does my stuff stop? That's our boundary. When we're talking about physical perimeters of property, that's one thing, but it gets a little more difficult when we're talking about emotional boundaries, psychological boundaries, relationship boundaries, because it's real easy for me to forget or not have a clear idea of what stuff's actually mine and what stuff is somebody else. Dr. Cloud talks about a couple that came in to see him, and they had a son who had graduated from college and was basically just sleeping on their couch, playing video games all day, eating stuff in their fridge, and really kind of offering nothing back to society. And so they tried to talk to him and convince him that, man, this has got to change. And he was like, this isn't a problem. So they went into Dr. Cloud and were like, okay, Dr. Cloud, help us. Help us convince our son that he's got a problem. And Cloud was like, hey, I hate to tell you this, but he's right. He doesn't have a problem. You got a problem. You've sheltered him so much from the consequences of his actions that he doesn't have to engage with the world. So you have got to figure out how to put him in that space where he has to deal with these pieces. When we talk about boundaries, though, it's really easy, especially in a Christian context, to come up with this idea that Christians don't deserve boundaries, that those aren't a thing that should exist for us. We look at verses about meeting other people's needs before we meet our own. We look at verses about taking care of other people who are broken and hurting. We look at verses about the last being first and the first being last, and we decide, oh, well, man, I shouldn't have boundaries at all. Those shouldn't exist for me. But I really want to challenge that idea. Let's look at 2 Corinthians 9, 7 through 8. Each of you should give what you have decided to give in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. I know what you're thinking. This is a verse about money. This isn't about boundaries. And you're right, but I want to use this as an analogy for just a minute. Because if you don't think that Christians should have boundaries, let's apply that to giving. If that's what you believe, then I want you to, at the end of the month, take all of your household income, and I want you to cash it out, every single dime. And I want you to go downtown, put it on a card table, just put all the cash on there and say, take what you need. And I know you guys are saying, well, that's not super responsible. I mean, first of all, how do I keep the lights on at my house? How do I feed my kids this month? I mean, I got stuff I got to take care of. I got bills. There's certain things that I've already agreed to do, and that won't work. Also, like, how do I even know that the people that take money are the ones that are the people that actually need it? Somebody might just need to make a payment on their boat and take all of my monthly income. Or what's even worse than that maybe is, how do I know that I'm not feeding somebody's negative habits? Somebody who's an addict gets a hold of that and just drives them deeper down. I agree with all that stuff, but what we have a tendency to do sometimes is say, I'm not going to have any boundaries, I'm just going to give to whoever comes first. And the thing that I'm trying to communicate to you is that we are limited. There is a top end of what we can offer. There's a limited number of hours in the day, and you have a limited number of emotional resources. So what I am advocating is emotional stewardship. Just like we are looking for stewardship in our financial responsibilities, I want us to be stewards in our emotional space. We also might get the idea that Jesus didn't really demonstrate boundaries, but I want to challenge that too. Let's look at Luke 5:15. Now, this is right after Jesus heals a man who has leprosy, and word's spreading and excitement is building. Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. He withdraws. He takes a step back. Sometimes we get this idea that the world is going to stop spinning if I don't make it happen. We get this idea that I am kind of too important to step back and draw a boundary. And if that's your perspective, then I want to point you back to this. Because if you don't think Jesus lived in a world where there were children to laugh with and hurt people to cry with, sick people to heal, and lost souls to save, then I got another story for you. Your time is not more valuable than the 3 years he spent in ministry to change the human experience for all of us forever. Understand that Christ demonstrates boundaries. He steps back. He spends time in prayer and focuses on the things that he needs to take care of in order to be more effective in his role. Sometimes we get this idea that Jesus also just didn't like conflict. That, man, he went to the cross and basically kept his mouth shut. So he wasn't going to draw a line at all. And for those of you that have that perspective, I want to remind you of times that he went to the leaders of his community and called them whitewashed tombs and vipers. Times that he fashioned a whip and cleared out the temple. This was not a guy that lived in fear of conflict. This was a guy that made a decision and followed it through. And that's what I'm asking you to do with your boundaries. We also serve a God of boundaries. If we look at the experience and the relationship that God has had with man, throughout time, we see that he creates people, puts them in this beautiful place, and what's the first thing he tells them? Here's my boundary for you. You guys have all this freedom, but stay away from this tree. Don't go and do this one thing. And of course, us being human beings, we head directly for that and did the thing we weren't supposed to do. We've crossed that boundary. Over and over again, through the Word, through the Bible, through His message, we see that God says, I want to have a relationship with you. Here's how I'm going to do that. But here's my boundary. And I can't have you in this space and engage with you in the way that I want you to, and that I want to. And over again, we see humankind violating that boundary and stepping across that line. I think we can even acknowledge it in our own hearts. We want to have a relationship with God, but I think there's times that we have even stepped across those boundaries and said, wow, man, I've ended up in a place I didn't want to be. The whole story of Christ reconciling us is that required sacrifice. That required God's Son giving his life in order for us to be back in a space where we were right with God. We also all have a line. If we get to this place where we're like, I just shouldn't have boundaries at all, understand that we all have a place that is too far if we're really honest with ourselves. And all I am advocating for is for us to be purposeful as we explore that. Now, some of you guys are like, all right, okay, you're talking to the people that might have trouble with boundaries, but man, I've got boundaries squared away. My boundaries, they look like that border between North and South Korea. They're 30 feet tall, we got razor wire and spotlights and tower snipers. I got boundaries. I'm good on boundaries. But I have to tell you that that's not what God intended either. What's interesting is when we see people that have built these massive barriers, which is really what that is. And when we see people that have no boundaries at all, it's often the exact same thing that's made them do those things. It's fear. It's often fear. We're scared of those intermediate places. We're scared of telling people no. We just say yes to everything, or we decide that, man, I can't teach class at church. If I teach those second graders, I'll be teaching second grade till that first class brings their second graders to me. I'll be doing it forever. So we decide that we're just going to say no. We're just going to, we're going to block everybody off, say no to everything, and then we won't have to navigate those little in-between pieces anymore. There's also sometimes a fear of a lack of our own value. I am worried that I don't have much value. I'm worried that, if I say yes to something, that I might not be able to actually do it. I might be putting myself at risk. I might not be capable. Or I'm worried that people won't love me unless I do. I'm worried that I don't have value other than all the stuff I do for people. Sometimes it's the same thing that takes us one direction or the other. I also want to challenge this idea with Scripture. We look at Matthew 25. And we hear the story of the talents. The master gives one guy 10 talents, one guy 5, one guy 2, and one guy 1 talent. And then he leaves 10, 5, and 2 do a pretty good job. 1 buries his talent in the ground and then comes back and says, okay, here's your talent back. And here's the master's response. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But for the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away from him. Christ's intent for us is for us to engage with the people around us, for us to reach out, to use our gifts, to not just be porous and have no boundaries, but also to not hide behind this wall because we're scared of interacting. We are supposed to take some risks. We're supposed to be in this space where we are opened up. Balance is the tricky part. Now, there's a bit of a hard thing I have to say too, because I worry that sometimes the place that we have the biggest walls and the biggest barriers, if we're really honest, is this room right here. If something terrible happens in your world, if you make a really big mistake, whose opinions are you worried about changing the most? Is it people at work? Is it your neighbors? Is it people in your community? Or is it people at church? Sometimes I think it's people at church. We're the most scared that we're going to show that we're not perfect. We may be the most scared of their judgment. And there's kind of a couple of ways that we can tackle that. The first one is if you are brave enough, if you are courageous enough, if you are able to lead the charge, be real. Admit the stuff that you're struggling with. Be honest. Be direct. Step up and communicate that. The other piece is we got to suspend our judgment of those people that have that courage. We've got to be able to say, they're struggling, they're a human being, just like I am. And if we can do both of those pieces, we might be able to create a church where we can communicate and do a whole lot better on that. I don't mean for this to be an indictment of this specific church, because I have seen people who are able to share and who are able to start to walk through those walls and those barriers. But I know in Christendom as a whole, that can be a place that we really do struggle. So how should boundaries work? Let's look back at this passage, Galatians 6:2. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load. Does anybody else think this is kind of a confusing passage? Because I read it and I'm like, okay, 6:2, carry each other's burdens. 6:5, each one should carry your own load. What? I mean, at face value, that sounds like it's contradictory there within a couple of passages. But when I looked at this Cloud book, and he digs through this a little bit more, what he presents is this maybe a little bit of a mistranslation. Burdens might be more appropriately translated as excess burdens, and load might be more appropriately translated as cargo or daily toil. So really, if we look at this through that lens, what it's saying is that each of you has responsibilities, things that just come along through the day, just being able to take care of the tasks and things that are put in front of you. That's your daily toil. That's your cargo. But every now and then, something comes out of left field. There's somebody in our family that passes away. We have an illness or a job loss or something that is an excess burden. It's huge. It's something more than we can handle on ourselves. And in those by ourselves. In those circumstances, it's time for us to pull together and reach out and really try to shoulder that burden together. So I want to leave you with just a couple of ideas on how we can hopefully increase our boundaries a little bit, how we can do a little bit better job on this. First of all, we have to accept boundaries in other people. If I expect for me to be the only person that has boundaries, that's probably not going to work really well. And so part of my job is when somebody says, hey, no, I can't do that, the answer is just no, for us to be like, okay. Because if we can acknowledge that, then that makes it a little easier for us later on to say, yeah, no, I'm sorry, I'm past my border. I'm past the stuff that's mine. So part of that is to decide that we are going to kind of create a culture where boundaries are okay, where healthy boundaries are possible. Secondly, we need to increase honesty, and this starts with ourselves. We need to really figure out, maybe asking the hard questions of why. why do I have trouble with boundaries? What is the need in me that I'm trying to fill by approval, or that I'm trying to fill by being too afraid to engage with people? It's time to ask some hard questions of yourself in order to increase your relationship with your boundaries. This leads to the second part of honesty, which is being honest in others, where we can directly say, yeah, this is my line. This is where I land, and that's what it is right now. Third is to examine your values. Because often we're not in a spot where we have to say yes to a good thing and no to a bad thing. Usually what it is I have to decide which good thing to say yes to. And so we need to take some time and really understand, what are the things that are most important to me? What are my priorities? What do I value the most highly? When am I fulfilled? When do I feel like my talents are being used most effectively? Because then I can sit down and be like, okay, this is good, but this is better. This is where I can be even more effective. And when those things come into conflict, I'm better able to navigate that. Next is to define your lines for yourself. Take some time and sit down and decide what those boundaries are when you're not in an emotionally charged situation. It's really difficult sometimes when there's a lot going on and we're disappointed or we're worried about disappointing someone and we have expectations and thoughts and, man, I say yes or I say no just because it's my knee-jerk reaction. So sometime when you actually have the opportunity to sit down and think about these things, what do I want for myself? What are the values that I'm looking at? And how do I use those to inform where my lines are? Figuring out what things recharge me and what things I'm kind of spending my energy on. Sometimes we need to do those hard things. Sometimes we need to push ourselves. But it is useful to at least be able to acknowledge that in our own minds. And lastly, we need to learn how to communicate those boundaries. If we're honest, sometimes we know who pushes us. We know the place that we have a really hard time drawing those lines. And the really useful strategy is to start off and sit down before we're in that conflict and say, okay, you're somebody that I have trouble with in this area, and I'm really trying to work on it. So here's my boundary, here's my line. And we have that conversation when there's not a lot of tension. And it makes it easier later on when something's difficult or something comes up for me to simply maintain a boundary instead of try to build it and try to establish it. It's easy for us to end up in a place where we are very isolated. It's easy for us to be lost cosmonauts. I've felt like that before. I bet most of us have, where we're completely lost and disconnected. But if that's where you are, then I want to tell you about one relationship that boundaries are not necessary in. One relationship where you can take everything that you are, all of your heart, and just lay it down. And that's your relationship with Christ. In this context, we can say, these are my needs. This is everything. I want to give it all to you. And God, I'm going to let you fill in the gap. If that's a relationship that you don't have, or if that's a relationship that you need to restore, then I want to encourage you to do that while we stand and sing.
There's a fountain free, 'tis free.